Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. Well, could the U.S. hive off a Canadian province due to a little-known ruling? This is seriously being looked at. Paul, as always, I want to thank you for being a part of the discussion. And as Alberta gets ready for a referendum of secession, definitely the U.S. is taking a look at this hard.
Well, yeah, thanks for joining us, Ken. I think we have to go back to, how much was it just Trump kind of making noises, trying to just rattle a few cages in Canada by talking about Canada being part of the United States and then sort of going quiet and then raising it again. And then, suddenly there was some developments in the state of Alberta. But before we get into that, I think what I found quite, and I'm not into politics, but I find it quite interesting how, and it's kind of surprised a lot of people in Canada, that Carney's been elected instead of Poiliev. I think we've agreed that's how it's pronounced. Apologies to any French listeners if that's wrong. But anyway, so he's been elected and which has surprised a lot of people. I think there was an expectation Poiliev would win, but it's Carney, and I'm not here to get into what Carney will do or won't do. But he seems to be still very interested in the sort of green initiative, for want of a better word. But what was telling is Alberta came out less than 24 hours after, obviously, Carney's victory, and basically made a statement which you can interpret it two ways. Either they're just using this as leverage to get policy initiatives put in place that they obviously the expectation Poiliev would have done so if he'd been the prime minister. Uh, and therefore, that's just a bit of brinkmanship. Or it might be, well, they want to deploy the brinkmanship, but they're also serious about having a referendum. And the referendum would be to achieve independence. Now, the Premier of Alberta, whose first name, forgive me, I don't remember, but the surname Smith, came out and announced something called Bill 54. This can make referendums a lot easier. It therefore, in essence, gives the people more power. And therefore, it's something Ottawa should be extremely concerned about. I mean, because obviously, less than a day after, as I said, Carney won, sorry, I remember now, her name's Danielle Smith, came out and mentioned Bill 54. Now, this should deeply concern the federal government because what it does is makes Alberta have what would trigger a referendum far easier. Because what you would now need is, or you would have needed, was 600,000 signatures in 90 days to force a vote on the issue. And the belief was, well, that's a hell of a tall order. The Bill 54 cuts that threshold, from what I understand, by 50%. And only therefore 10% of voters from the last election need to trigger this referendum. And you're given 120 days to do so instead of 90 to collect the requisite amount of signature. So you would have thought Ottawa is going, hang on a minute, this bill's legitimate, and therefore that significantly increases the risk of a referendum coming to pass in Alberta. And when asked if this would therefore open the door to separation from the state of Canada, Smith said, I believe in Alberta's sovereignty, note within a united Canada, but also said, but there's a citizen initiated referendum process. And if citizens want to put a question on the ballot and get signatures, those questions will be put forward, saying, I don't want to prejudge what a question might be. So you can interpret that how you like. And I'm not going to put words in Smith's mouth as to what she actually meant by saying that. But I personally could interpret that to say, well, I'm not, as the state premier, going to sit there and say, well, I'm advocating we have a referendum to leave and cede from the state of Canada. But if you citizens of Alberta, via Bill 54, were to ask to have a citizen initiated referendum process, then I'm not in a position to object to that. I have to follow state law, and state law says if you want to apply Bill 54 in relation to this, and then you get the signatures, then those questions will have to be answered. And if the question is, we want a referendum to leave or cede from Canada, then that will have to happen. I mean, and so that really raises a number of serious questions, which we'll come on to shortly. But I think that sort of lays out the nuts and bolts of what has changed very abruptly in the state of Alberta. And I would hazard to guess that if Poilievre had been elected instead of Carney, I don't think this would have actually have happened. Now, of course, as I said, this could be brinkmanship, but we'll come on to what the ramifications are in a broader sense and where this could end up leading to.
Yeah, one thing that we need to look historically, and some of our listeners here may have heard this in the past, but even going back to the 1970s, the province of Quebec has, because it's not mainly, but a large portion of French Canadians live there and have been at odds with the Anglo leadership of many of the other provinces. They've wanted to secede, have a secession movement going back to the 1970s. So secession in Canada is not a new thing. One of the more interesting things is, of course, during the pandemic, it really started to rise when Trudeau was in power, and they had the standoff with the truckers. So this led to the introduction of the Alberta Sovereignty Within a United Canada Act of 2022. So Alberta was looking at the potential and possibility of seceding from the primary government of Ottawa in Ontario, to be its own self-supported while also under the auspices of Canada. Well, here's the interesting thing, of course. Canada still has ties as part of the Commonwealth to the British Crown. We even saw this. There was a video that came out when Trudeau was elected a second time. He gave a loyalty oath to the Crown. So there's still that, but even more, before there was an Alberta, before there were many of these provinces, in 1899, the Cree Nation, First Nations, the Cree Nation, for example, made a treaty with the Crown, the British Crown, regarding their sovereignty. This was even before Alberta. So Alberta, if that treaty is broken through secession, now all of a sudden, the First Nations, the Indians, the Cree Nation, would then declare its treaty with the Crown broken and wouldn't recognize Alberta, and it would just be absolute chaos. So there's a lot of different mechanisms going in this. And one of them particularly, of course, at its bottom line, is Alberta not completely separating from Canada, but just being a sovereignty unto itself.
Well, yes, and that's exactly a possibility because it depends what the referendum stipulates. I mean, it might just stipulate something that it is still part of Canada, but has far more independence and sovereignty. Of course, it could mean ceding from Canada as well. Interesting, I've not even mentioned this to you, Ken, but I've got relatives who actually live in Calgary. So I'll have to talk to them at some point and ask them what their understanding is or thoughts on this. I mean, so that would be quite interesting when I get around to talking to them. But coming back to this whole Bill 54, it also apparently introduces other changes, like it bans electric vote tabulators. You need to have hand-counted ballots. You have to have mandates counts within 12 hours. You can recall officers a lot easier. So this might potentially therefore change how the referendum is conducted, which may actually be hugely beneficial. Also, from what I understand, and I'm not sure I've heard this. I got told this, so forgive me if this is incorrect, but there was claims that Smith had said the Albertans feel like they've been betrayed and they're treated like their interests don't matter, and that their economic needs are just given short shrift and treated like they should just be seen and not heard. So that, if indeed is the case, then that would just add gravity to the idea that this referendum is I wouldn't say distinct possibility, but more than a passing chance of a possibility. Now, the other thing, of course, is apparently, and this could be where the brinkmanship comes in, and it's using it as leverage, because there are also demands to be made to Carney, which the Prime Minister, of course, would be the repeal of Bill C-69. And that was to enact an Impact Assessment Act and the Canadian Energy Regulator Act, to amend Navigation Protection Act. And this all actually has potentially huge ramifications for the energy sector in Canada. So get rid of that. They want to lift the British Columbia tanker ban. That's the oil tanker moratorium even ban that bans oil tankers from British Columbia's north coast. They want the scrapping of climate policies, pipeline corridors to markets, one, the ending emission caps for oil and gas. And they've given Carney a number of months to address those demands. It's not a few months, I'm not sure exactly, maybe 6, 7, 8 months, something like that. And if that fails to materialize, then the referendum vote, if that indeed happens, would give the people of Alberta an opportunity for an independence vote. I mean, and that could potentially have huge ramifications, because if that vote happens and the people want to cede from Canada, they will have a legal right to do so. And then the question is, does that give Alberta total independence? Does it want total independence? Does it want far more sovereignty, but to be part of Canada still? Does it cede completely? And the question, therefore, that follows on from that, from my perspective, are the Americans looking at this going, well, this is interesting. Here's a state that is no longer, if it is assuming on this basis, no longer part of Canada. Maybe it would like to become the 51st state of the United States. And at that point, and we're speculating totally here, what would stop the people of Alberta saying, well, we'll have a referendum vote to become part of the United States, potentially? And I stress potentially, I'm not saying it's a given. But a lot of this does revolve around the fact that all this kind of green initiative, climate change initiatives is very damaging to the economic prosperity of Alberta. And, there's all this net zero regulation, and Alberta wants to build natural gas plants there. And obviously, if they were to cede and become autonomous, they could say, well, we no longer recognize the authority of the Canadian state. You can't tell us how we're going to implement power initiatives in our own state. That's basically telling the Ottawa government, you no longer are going to be dictating to us how we manage our energy, make up how we manage it, and regulate our own state's energy requirements. So it could be a way of just brokering a deal that says, well, we'll allow the state of Alberta to implement the initiatives we just stated, but equally, if it isn't the case and the referendum happens, don't be surprised to see the United States start to offer some form of protection in inverted commas, some form of assistance to the state of Alberta, who may then end up voting to become part of the United States. And then the question is, if Alberta does this, what about Saskatchewan or Manitoba or wherever else, for that matter? And will that then suddenly, I mean, this is not about Quebec wanting to be part of the United States, but is Quebec going to flex its muscles again and go, well, we'd like independence from Ottawa? And at what point does the state of Canada start to kind of not really exist? Now, we're getting well ahead of ourselves there, but this is potentially the start of where we're going to. And this isn't about the United States taking over Canada, but it might start to cleave bits off with the cooperation and the legal mandate to do so by the will of the people of, say, Alberta, for example.
Yeah, there's some precedent in this, and it goes back to the Panama Canal. For those who don't know the history of it, uh, there was no country of Panama or the Isthmus. There was simply Colombia. It was Colombia. And Colombia was in negotiations with Teddy Roosevelt's administration to go ahead and do this canal. And Colombia wasn't going, didn't want to follow through all the demands that were coming from the U.S. So the U.S. subtly allowed the individuals in the isthmus to declare themselves a sovereign nation, and the U.S. instantaneously declared them and recognized them as Panama. And there really wasn't much Canada could do, Colombia could do, because the U.S. sent down ships and protected the new fledgling country that they had created. Of course, automatically it was signed, the canal, and the U.S., while they didn't control the government, they had control of the port system until 1999, and they pretty much paid for the construction of the canal. Take a look at what Alberta is. Alberta is the oil, gas, mining, agriculture, limited agriculture. Saskatchewan's a bigger agriculture, but it is, for all equivalency, Ottawa, Montreal, Quebec, Ontario, that area is the liberal bastion. They're like New York, California, Illinois, New Jersey. Alberta and Saskatchewan is like the Midwest. It's conservative. It has been treated unfairly by the elites who have run Canada for well over the last 50 years, going back to even Pierre Trudeau. So you have these different areas, and it would not be out of the realm to exactly what you said. The U.S. would not come in and say, you're the 51st state, but they would recognize the sovereignty of Alberta, recognize the sovereignty of Saskatchewan, who just a few days ago came out and started throwing its own feelers that said, hey, if Alberta secedes, then we might just as well too. Instantaneously, the U.S. recognizes it and then signs protection agreements, just similar to what, hey, Iran, Russia, and China have done. And there's not much that Canada or the UK in this case could do about it. And all of a sudden, they're dictating their own terms.
Yeah, absolutely. So something to worth discussing, and we'll see what happens. But it's going forward. But it's a very interesting story. It's not got a lot of coverage because people, I don't think, realise the gravity of this, and I think that's partly because there's a bit of a belief of all the noise coming out of the White House and Trump that, this was all just irrelevant. Well, there's a legal precedent. The legal precedent might be enforced, and we might be having a very interesting conversation in the coming months. I wouldn't imagine anything this year, but maybe there may be an acceleration of developments. It just depends, given everything else that's going on economically, financially, and geopolitically in the West. Some things might suddenly accelerate, but it's a very interesting and fascinating development that may see the makeup of Canada change forever.
Yeah, absolutely. Paul, were there any other tidbits you wanted to add to this conversation?
No, I think that's fine.
Absolutely. As always, thank you very much for your insight
Yes, and
regarding this.
likewise.
And to everybody here at the Sirius Report community, thank you, as always, for your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.